All right. So it's all yours, David.
Thank you, Scott. And good evening, everybody. Wanted to talk tonight, for whatever reason, there seems to be a lot of people are having high anxiety in my world lately. And so I wanted to just talk, we've touched this before, but just to kind of do a little reminder about anxiety, addiction, and recovery. And just to talk about anxiety, because it seems so pervasive, not only with addicts, but just in our world more and more these days. I've read some astounding statistics now with COVID, and just the levels of anxiety are dramatically increased across the board, just because living is kind of complicated and unpredictable. And so we're just walking around with a whole bunch of stress, and some of it is related to fear and anxiety. And that's kind of where I want to start, is the idea of fear versus anxiety. And I have kind of my own spin on that, but fear, is a really, really important emotion. Fear, like all our emotions, are a source of information. It's like a warning light. It's like saying, hey, wait a minute, pay attention to this. Something's going on here. So fear is really, really important. The problem with addiction or addictive kinds of personalities is that we tend to take emotions and bottle them up or get stuck with them or recycle them or get caught in an endless loop with them. And that is kind of generally what happens as anxiety is born out of fear. Fear is this good, healthy feeling that we're meant to experience and release and do something about to keep us safe. But when those fears get kind of caught up in this endless loop in our head, kind of reverberating around without ever escaping, they sometimes worsening as it spins faster, that to me is anxiety, this kind of endless loop that really can cause us problems. So fear is a good thing, anxiety not so much in my book. And one interesting thing I found as a therapist is a lot of people don't recognize that they're anxious until they have some kind of physical symptom or some other stress response, or they respond in a way that's out of context with the situation. And it's like, whoa, what's going on with me? That was kind of harsh. And so I think a lot of times these physical symptoms are really important to clue into. And what makes it a little harder is that these physical symptoms differ from each person. So somebody might get a stomach ache, somebody might get stress on their neck, somebody else might get shoulders, somebody might get cramps, somebody gets shortness of breath. So it just varies. And I think it's really important for all of us to know what our bodies are telling us, because we all have kind of unique constellations of symptoms and physical symptoms that relate to different emotions, depending on kind of how they're mapped within us. I think it's really important. But what we know about addiction in general is that addiction is a really quick remedy to deal with not only anxiety, but all kinds of emotions. So, and that's the beginning of trouble, because instead of identifying the fear, responding to it, moving on with our lives, things get trapped. We get very uncomfortable with the anxiety, and we start to medicate. We start to self-medicate. And that can be either numbing it through different kinds of opiates or alcohol or food or TV binge watching or shopping, those kind of things. It could also be sensation seeking. It can be the other side, intensity, sex, porn, just escaping into kind of arousal and intensity. So these are not great ways to obviously to manage anxiety, but we know that anxiety, once it sets in motion, becomes kind of self-perpetuating, because it can start with different kinds of distorted thoughts, which result in a feeling, which result in behaviors, which kind of provide this feedback loop to keep the whole thing kind of escalating and going. And I think if you talk to most addicts, as they're bottoming out or in early recovery, there's a whole lot of anxiety there that they're feeling. So anxiety is characteristic of withdrawal. I was talking to our clients today about withdrawal symptoms. We know that if you're a drug addict or an alcoholic, and you're going to have a lot of anxiety when you go through detox or withdrawal. But we also know that if you're a sex or porn addict, you're also going to have a whole lot of anxiety and a whole lot of irritability and other signs and symptoms of withdrawal, because there's definitely withdrawal from that. And so we have this irritability, a lot of people are preoccupied, people are apprehensive, and so on. So what does an addict typically do with that? We drop into defense mode. Instead of really dealing with the source of the anxiety or getting help or doing something more productive, people try to take control of their lives, right? So we have this excessive need for control, because everything is sort of spinning out of control in our lives. It's causing us a lot of stress. And so we try to control what we can. The problem is that we can't control very much. As we learn in recovery, we can control ourselves, but that's why the Serenity Prayer is so helpful, because there's a whole bunch of things we can't control. And if we're trying to control the world to reduce our anxiety levels, it's going to be an exercise in frustration. So we really need to adapt better strategies to do with anxiety. We can also ignore them. You know, addicts, if there's anything we do really well, is avoid. We avoid dealing with stuff. We avoid taking action. We avoid feeling something. We defer and delay and avoid. And so a lot of times we ignore the psychological signs of stress. We ignore the physical signs of stress. We run ourselves down. We get sick. We get ulcers. We get in accidents because we're not paying attention, that kind of thing. Other ways to deal with anxiety, maybe if I don't feel okay on the inside, I can get you to tell me that I'm okay, or I can get you to somehow give me validation or approval. And then I am basically relying on external sources from the world to say, hey, wait a minute, you're okay, don't have anxiety. But unfortunately, we know this from experience, there's never enough reassurance in the outside world to solve that pit of anxiety within me. You know, we see this oftentimes with traumatized partners of sex addicts who have, had the rug pulled out of under their lives, and their lives are upside down. So one of the strategies when they're having anxiety about this after discovery is like they want information, they want data, they want security of finding out. So they become super sleuths and super detectives and put tracers and get emails, and just with the strategy of, if I can just get enough information, I won't have the anxiety. But unfortunately, there's never enough anxiety. There's never enough information to really allay the anxiety or the anxiety symptoms. A couple of things we do, we turn to perfectionism. So I'm going to expect myself to be perfect. So if I don't make a mistake, I don't have to be anxious. And of course, nobody is perfect, and that perfectionism is also a flawed strategy. And then this whole thing is wrapped up in this world of negative self-talk. And I've talked here before about self-talk, but it's just important to recognize that many of us have this chatter, this nonstop chatter in our head. And a lot of it is negative, very critical, self-critical, what an idiot, God, you did that again, how stupid are you? That kind of stuff that's so demoralizing and damaging, and also just fuels that feeling of anxiety that we have, that we're not okay, that we're kind of spinning out of control. So those are the bad news. So what can we do about this? What are some good things? So for mild anxiety, right, the kind that probably most addicts experience, one of the things I think the huge tool is to stay in the present. What causes a lot of anxiety is spinning out and spending a whole bunch of time in the future worrying about this or that or what's going to happen. And again, these may be very real situations that probably should cause anxiety, but there's certain things we just can't have an answer to right now. And that's where that serenity prayer is also useful. So trying to stay in the present, not get stuck regretting the past, not get stuck worrying about the future, but really be in the here and now. And that's a tremendously powerful tool to help us kind of get rid of some of that anxiety. I've already mentioned several times the serenity prayer, recognizing what we can control and what we can't, right? Learning, the other thing I'd point out in the beginning was we're often not aware of the level of stress. And so just learning to read your body, learning to read your thoughts and feelings, be aware of your stress, and then to really start to take action instead of worrying about it or trying to reduce it from external sources, to start to do things that are useful, like relaxation exercises or breathing or physical exercise or talking to someone about it. There's all kinds of things we can do. And we have to lighten up on ourselves, not be so critical of ourselves. Mistakes are part of life. Mistakes are how we learn. If our goal is to never make a mistake, we're going to mess up pretty badly. So I think just to kind of really lighten up on ourselves, watch the negative self-talk, stay in the present, and really use that serenity prayer over and over again. Now, if it gets more serious, and anxiety can be more serious, there's other kinds of therapies that are really useful. Cognitive behavioral therapy is the standard kind of psychotherapy for anxiety. It's very productive. There's very powerful techniques. Some people find that a certain type of medication is helpful for anxiety. This is tricky though, because what a doctor will often do is prescribe a really powerful drug like a benzodiazepine for people that are anxious. And benzodiazepines like Xanax or Klonopin or Valium, they're meant to be used only in the acute situation, very short term. And oftentimes they're prescribed for long term. People get addicted, and it's a nasty withdrawal. It requires a doctor's supervision to be withdrawn. So this psychotherapy though is an answer. The medication, and we know this is true for depression too, that the combination typically of psychotherapy plus a medication, if it's required, has the best outcome for serious anxiety and serious depression for that matter. So in some, I think just kind of be realistic about what's going on. If you have anxiety, assess how bad it is, see if you can intervene on yourself with your comrades in recovery and your social support system. And if it's more serious, you can talk to your therapist or your doctor about it. And there are other solutions as well. So I think I'll stop with that. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. I have a couple of questions, and we've got some in the Q&A. We've got one left from last week.
All right.
So you mentioned that one of the things that we'll do when we're feeling anxiety is we'll seek external validation, or if we're a betrayed partner, we'll start Sherlocking, trying to get all the information we can. Are these useful in the short term to bring the anxiety down, or should we just avoid them altogether? I know they don't work long term.
Right, you're right. They don't work long term. I think in the short term, I think it's helpful to be curious about the situation, be curious about what's going on, to be curious about what can I do, what do I need to kind of help release. So I think that in that point of view, just getting your bearings, it's very useful to get information from that point of view, get feedback from other people, perspectives. But I think at that point, we have to take an action or let it go or do something. It's when we get caught in that loop of just a little bit more before I do something, a little bit more, a little bit more. That's where we get, I think so it's
ultimately, whether we're an addict or we're a betrayed partner caught in the loop, we need ultimately healthier coping mechanisms. We need support networks and therapy, and we need to be able to do grounding and things like that.
Exactly.
And stay out of the wreckage of the future.
Right. Exactly.
Addicts, we live in the wreckage of the past and the wreckage of the future. We forget about the present. It doesn't work very well, and the wreckage of the future almost never comes to pass.
Right.
In my experience,
like 99.9%.
Yeah, I can imagine just horrific futures. I'm like a bad science fiction movie, in my head. And I look out the window and it's a little hazy today, but the sun is still shining and it's warm. There's food. And, yeah. So let's go to the question left from last week. So it says, does personalization / externalization of the addiction help? Like saying it is the addict in me that did this or said this. Does that help reduce shame? And is doing inner child work or shame shadow work a way of kind of externalizing the addiction? Like, I'm not a bad person. I've done bad things because of my addiction, that kind of thing.
Right. I think that's a great question and a really useful one too, because you'll hear this often and people get kind of put off by that. Sometimes the talk in 12-step meetings about kind of personifying the addiction. But I do think, I use this as a therapist sometimes too, I think it's really useful as a way of conceptualizing that this disorder is separate from me, and that the things I've done, perhaps under the influence, are different than the core of who I am as a human being. And I think, so in that way, looking at it almost as an entity, an external entity that's attached itself, although you don't want to relinquish responsibility, because that's always the primary core of recovery, is to like own what we've done and take responsibility for that. But it also, it's helpful to help us separate the things I've done from who I am in a way. And so we often discuss with our clients, we're good people who've done bad things, if you will. So it's a way of kind of holding that idea of I'm responsible for what I've done. There's no getting around that, and I need to deal with that and make amends for that, or whatever I need to do. But it also isn't the totality of who I am. And I think that's the useful concept about externalizing some of that. You're talking about my addict, that kind of thing. So like anything, if it's taken to extreme, people start to really personify their addiction and make this whole other alter ego. I think we can start to kind of get too disconnected there. But I think almost as for me, it's a conceptualizing tool that's useful to help people understand, because I think what we see early in recovery, especially, is people are so riddled with guilt and shame, and this shame core that kind of can really spiral down, that they can't really see themselves as anything but that horrible kind of loser person. And so I think that helps them start to identify these different pieces of themselves. And then the pieces brings me to the second part of that. We talk about inner child work or internal family systems work. We're starting to identify these pieces of ourselves. And what I love about that work is that it's oftentimes, in fact, I think earlier in psychotherapy, therapists were kind of guilty of vilifying those parts of ourselves, the angry defensive part, or the guilty part, or the victim part, or this kind of these aspects of the human experience that we all have at some point. But what those therapies do is that say these are parts of ourselves that developed for a reason, and the reason they developed was to keep us safe at some level emotionally. And so if I have an angry defensive part that is going to go for your jugular if it feels threatened, instead of trying to just say bad and extricate that part of myself, IFS, inner family systems, look at how do we embrace that part of ourselves, and instead of not let that run the show, but say like, okay, I'm an adult now, I have more emotional skills, but to understand those are parts that are trying to help us. They're misinformed, but it's a nice way of embracing all the different parts of me. Everybody's welcome in an internal family systems model. And I think that's a really useful way, instead of kind of taking parts of ourselves that we really dislike and want to disown, but really understanding where they came from and what they're trying to do. And basically saying, thanks, I got this, to those shadow parts that are really child parts. So great question. And I believe that kind of work, by the way, is really useful, I think, for recovery.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of work groups going on. One is called Healing Attachment Wounds, and it does some of this work. Troy Love is teaching that one, and next month we're starting a work group with Eddie Caparucci, which is called Going Deeper, and it's specifically inner child work. So anybody's interested in that, those are low-cost ways to explore inner child and parts with people who are very, very expert in those areas. So
I want to put in a plug for them. They are the two, like one of the two top people in the country for this. So
yes,
it's really excellent stuff. Great.
Absolutely. They've pretty much written the books on this stuff,
Right.
Both of them.
That's right.
So yeah, nothing but the best here. Thank you very much. All right, let's jump into the Q&A. Oh, good. I see one of them is one of the questions that I asked, or that I was going to ask. So I'm glad I held off my asking. But first we have, this is from an addict. Do porn addicts mostly stay as porn addicts and not typically graduate to love or sex addiction? If so, porn and masturbation can help stop men, women from engaging in prostitution and or cheating in their, so like, if you don't want to cheat or you don't want to go to prostitutes, can you just look at porn and masturbate? I love this question. Yeah, I'll let you go first because I have lots of thoughts.
Yeah, actually, thanks for the question. So let me pick this apart a little bit. So we talk about porn addicts, of course, and then perhaps moving toward love or sex addiction. And I want to just draw a distinction between love addiction and sex addiction, because sex addiction is all about kind of sexual acting out, all about the rush of dopamine and adrenaline and those kinds of things. Love and romance addiction is more about oxytocin. It's a whole different experience that's has maybe more of an emotional component, but I think they're two different things. So I wouldn't actually merge them in the same thing. Now
they're both still used for purposes of escape, but it's a different neurobiological mechanism.
Right, totally, exactly right. They're both used to just check out. Now we often see porn addicts and sex addicts combined, right, in the same person. That's a very typical progression and co-occurring behaviors. We also see sometimes porn addicts along with love and romance addicts as well, but I think maybe not as commonly, at least among men. I think as we get more information about women who are sex addicts, we may see that there's some slightly different statistics on that. But I think to your bigger question here is that can we use kind of some of these behaviors to slow or stop the development of some other addiction, some other area? I think that's a flawed strategy and a dangerous one, because if we are, Scott agrees on that. I predicted that. if we're addicts, and I would say the ability to become addicted to sex and porn is probably stronger than it is to even alcohol. There are different risk factors. The way sex and porn gets into our brain with dopamine, it's equivalent to cocaine and meth, and it really can pull people in. So I think we are addicted anyway. And so these other strategies that we might use as a stopgap or replacement, we have a very high likelihood of becoming addicted to those as well. And so I think really the only way to stop progression of addiction, the only way to stop the damage of it is to get into recovery. And I think most of us who are addicts probably toyed with the idea of, do I really have a problem or not, for way too long, when it was clear to everybody else we have a problem. And so I wouldn't play with that too long if you think you do, but just really take a cold hard look at it, because I think we can't substitute one for the other. It ends up in the same dangerous place. So Scott, go.
Yeah, the first bit here, do porn addicts mostly stay as porn addicts and not graduate to, usually it would be sex addiction. Some do, some don't. This is why we have online work groups for sex addicts, and we have online work groups for porn addicts, because the porn addicts, who sign up for the porn work group typically don't have other sexual behaviors. Often it is their only sexual outlet is pornography. Particularly the younger guys. So sometimes porn addicts stay as porn addicts, the same way that sometimes alcoholics never dabble with, dry goods, as we call them, or vice versa. But most people are more garbage cans, like alcoholics also do drugs and vice versa. Porn addicts will also chase webcams and prostitutes or strip clubs or other things. Often, but some porn addicts are very pure porn addicts, and more than I think people might realize, because there's so much shame. It's really hard to talk about it. And the porn work groups that I teach, most of the guys come in and they have never talked about this with anyone until the first week of this class, and it was all they could do to just sign up. And half of them use a fake name the first week, and it's fine. I get it. So, because there's so much shame about it, we don't know about all the porn addicts out there. As far as using porn and masturbation to stop as a tool for managing a larger sex addiction, trust me, I tried it. I would wake up on a Saturday morning and I would think, wow, I've got Saturday and Sunday and I've got a million things to do, but my addiction is running rampant. So if I just look at some porn and masturbate and get it over with, then maybe I'll get something done. Maybe then I can go to the store and gas up the car. And it never worked, because sex addiction and porn addiction are not about the sex. They're not about the orgasm. They're about escape. So what I wanted from my addiction was escape. So I could look at porn and masturbate, and then I would want to look at more porn and whether I could masturbate or not, I still wanted more escape. So I would continue escaping, or I would switch to drugs, because I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict too. Anything to get out of my head. It's sort of like, a heroin addict saying, I don't want to do heroin today, so I think I'll get so drunk that I pass out before I can do heroin. It's still a really bad idea, and it just doesn't work. So yeah. Well, what did you call it?
A common strategy, though.
Strategy. It is a common strategy. Yeah. We always talk about this in the work groups for sex and porn addicts both. Somebody inevitably asked this question, and I asked if anybody in the group has done this, and everyone raises their hand. We've all tried it, and I say, "Does it work?" And everybody goes, "Not so much." So yeah, flawed strategy. I love that. I'm going to borrow that, David. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it's perfect. I think we can, we can do other things. So I tried healthy stuff, thinking that I became a vegan. I got a cat. I got a master's degree to fill time. I did everything I could to avoid facing that the real problem was my addiction. And so I think ultimately we have to face the addiction. And it's the only way to escape that preoccupation.
Yeah, the answer to addiction is to recover from addiction, and there's a lot of work involved that focuses on addiction. I mean, getting a master's will keep you occupied, and you're probably not drunk while you're in class, but
Well, my strategy was like, I have too much time in the evenings when I come home from
Right.
work. If I fill my time, I won't drink and drug. Well, guess what? I would drink and drug at 11 o'clock when I got home.
Right.
So, you know,
And then have a really wicked hangover when you went to work the next
exactly.
day.
And
Yeah.
mess up everything, both work and studies. So yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
work.
So this is the question, one of the questions that I had written down while you were talking, David. It's the chicken and the egg question. How are anxiety and depression from addiction different from non-addicts who have anxiety and depression, and which comes first for addicts, anxiety and depression or addiction? So the chicken and the egg question, and how do they differ from addicts to non-addicts?
Right. So this is a really uh, potentially confusing issue, because if I were to draw, you know, addiction and depression and anxiety on a piece of paper as in a flow chart, there'd be arrows going every direction,
Yeah,
right? Because we
it'd be
know
a big
that
circle.
it'd be a
Yeah.
big circle. Uh, because we know addiction, rather, sorry, anxiety and depression are risk factors for the development of addictive disorders. And we also know that addictive disorders create both anxiety and depression. So it's a big mess, and they kind of compound each other. And I think one truth is that if you talk to any addict, they probably have high levels of both depression and anxiety, and they have them afterwards, and they probably had them before. It's all just made worse by the addictive disorders. I think the difference, and I'm not sure, you could make a case either way, right? That there is not much difference, that anxiety and depression are just that, and they can be experienced by an addict or not. I think the problem with something that comes out of addictive disorders is that there's far less, it's just muddier and murkier. There's more denial in place. There's more systems in place. People aren't as aware of what they're feeling. It's kind of murky and messy. And I think also, and this is where it's scary, is that I've seen depression particularly really overtake people before they kind of knew what hit them. And so people can bottom out quickly. These drugs, we're talking to our clients today about how sex and porn addiction, the only trick the brain has to adapt to it is to what's called downregulate the dopamine, which means the brain starts to kill off its own dopamine receptors, so it doesn't have as much dopamine flowing around the system. And so that is when you kind of start to cut back, if you get in recovery, you can't get adequate dopamine for a while. That fortunately repairs itself, but there's a lot of depression that flows from that. So there's biochemical changes, there's structural changes in our brain, there's all these impacts that do make the depression, anxiety as a result of addiction a little bit different than it would be ordinarily. But I think probably the biggest single distinction is that anxiety and depression in the system, in the context of addiction, are that much harder to treat. It's really harder to address because the addiction itself is such a powerful force to keep those things growing and driving them forward. So I have found, basically, if people can get in recovery, get through that period of brain kind of restoration, which is 3 to 6 months, and in most people, their moods really start to even out. That's why I don't recommend getting onto an antidepressant immediately, unless in some cases it's appropriate. But I think there's a lot of times if people just give it a chance, their brains will start to stabilize, and the depression really starts to wane, and the anxiety starts to fade as well. So I think recovery is probably the best treatment we have for anxiety and depression that is mixed up with addiction. And there are a few people that after 2 or 3 months, if you're still really miserable with anxiety and depression, then therapy and perhaps medication can help. But I think I would just give it time in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience in my active addiction, particularly the last 10 years of it, I was suffering from horrible depression and anxiety, just chronic, to the point where I went to see multiple therapists, and for help with my depression and anxiety. Never mentioned my problems with addiction because I didn't want to. My addiction was the solution to my depression and my anxiety, right? It's how I escaped those feelings. So of course I'm not going to mention that's not the problem, right? But as David said, what it was doing to my brain was it was kind of shutting down the pleasure center. It was down regulating me. So I couldn't experience pleasure even when I was having fun, or should have been
Right.
experiencing pleasure.
Right.
And
But
then,
things that used to give you pleasure, like good food or old
right,
friends, or
chocolate cake
yeah,
tasted like cardboard. I mean, I
yeah,
had to be
exactly. Yeah.
high to eat at the end of my addiction because food tasted like crap unless I bumped up my dopamine a little bit with marijuana just to eat. And that's common for marijuana addicts. You'll hear it a lot from them. But when I got sober, suddenly I didn't have my coping mechanism, and my depression and anxiety really went off the rails initially because suddenly now I don't have any way to regulate them. I have to feel them, which was really difficult. But somewhere around the 6 month to 1 year mark for me, um, my brain started to adjust back to normal. And I got back to baseline, and I was able to experience pleasure again, and my depression and anxiety levels were way down. I still have depression and I still have anxiety, but not all the time. It's usually situational. Um,
Right.
you know, and it's nothing like it was in my active addiction. So, chicken and the egg, did I have the depression and anxiety first? Probably. But the addiction, what I did to medicate the depression and anxiety with the addiction made them so much worse. And when I removed addiction from the equation, I went back to where I was before, which is easily manageable.
I just wanted to add too, I think one of the powerful forces that really help resolve anxiety and depression in recovery is that we get connected to other people, right? For me, I came out of real isolation, and a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, and just everything else being neutral. I think just having a circle of people that started to get to know me, that I could trust, where I felt like I belonged, was hugely important at making my depression kind of fade. It was very much what I was looking for. So I think just the act of recovery can be therapeutic itself.
Yeah. This next question here, I'm just going to paraphrase for you. This is somebody who has symptoms of porn addiction, but also suffers from obsessive thoughts, OCD thoughts, obsessive compulsive disorder, not just with porn and masturbation, but other aspects of life, like work, relationships, etc. Does this person need treatment for porn addiction, for OCD, for both? How do we distinguish and come up with a treatment plan for this individual?
That's a great question. There are certain other disorders that can create sexually compulsive behavior that we have to kind of rule out. One of those being bipolar. In the manic phase of bipolar illness, people will act out much like a sex addict, have a lot of sex partners and do kind of high risk, crazy things. And so that's one area. OCD is another area where people can act out compulsively out of this compulsive urge. And by the way, obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. It's appropriate we're talking about anxiety tonight. But so there are other kinds of disorders that can result in behavior that looks just like sex addiction. So one of the things we have to do is kind of do what we call a differential diagnosis, figure out, okay, well, it's not this or it's not that, and it could be this, and kind of see what's going on. That said, OCD is a very common co-occurring disorder with a lot of addiction, but especially sex addicts. I think, if I recall, it's around 25 or 30%. It's a high number of co-occurring ADHD and sex addiction. And so it does come down to like, what do we do? How do we treat it? I will tell you that most people that we see now, granted, we have a pre-selected audience here, but in our clients, but I think most times when we see sexual behavior, it's truly sex addiction, and there may be a little piece of OCD in there. OCD, just to explain it briefly, is an anxiety disorder, as I mentioned, but it's an anxiety disorder similar to where we were talking earlier about getting information from external sources to make me feel better. It's my internal anxiety bubbles up, and instead of being able to control my anxiety, it's a little bit of magical thinking, but I just think, well, if I can control these external things in my life, then the anxiety will go away. So if I, tap every square on my door before I turn the key, or if I am cooking, I have to do this in order and that in order and that in order. If I mess it up, I have to start all over again. And OCD is progressive. It gets worse and worse. So people's lives kind of gradually get consumed by these rituals that they take on. So OCD is a true thing. It's a terribly disruptive thing. When it gets bad, it's incredibly disruptive to someone's life and happiness for people. So it does need to be treated. The good news is that there are good treatments for OCD. There's a lot of cognitive behavioral talk therapy treatments. There's also a lot of relatively benign medication like SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that we use commonly for antidepressant factors that can also be treated for OCD. So I guess the question, what to do first in this case, when we're looking at somebody compulsively using porn, I guess try to get the behavior under control, right? That's the first step, is to see, what can I get this under control? Can I stop? And what happens when I stop? And what gets in my way when I stop? And then see if those compulsive urges overwhelm the person's ability. And I think usually with a little time, a therapist can start to differentiate. We've had OCD clients, people that are sex addicts and suffering from OCD. And there's some pretty remarkable symptoms, counting things, counting ceiling tiles, counting designs on the carpet. I remember a client once in my private practice being really disturbed. I couldn't figure out why. I had a bookcase behind me and my books were not in alphabetical order and it was really upsetting him. So that kind of thing. So those are cases where it just goes way beyond sex addiction, right? And we try to disturb those, but the beginning in both situations, try to get a handle on it without other intervention and see what happens. And then we can start to differentiate what the causes are.
Yeah. And OCD, there's no element of pleasure, by the way. It's a compulsive behavior and it's used for escape, but there's no element of pleasure.
And to reduce anxiety, not pleasure. Yeah.
Addiction, we do get an element of pleasure. Alcohol gives us an element of pleasure. Porn, whatever, gives us an element of pleasure. That's one of the primary differences between addiction and OCD.
Right. Right.
But they're both used to escape, usually anxiety with those OCD.
Yeah. Those sessions are not fun for people.
No, there's nothing fun about counting ceiling tiles. What are your thoughts on using supplements or natural ways of treating anxiety, like L-theanine or lavender oil? Healthcare industry does not have a good track record on prescribing non-addictive medication.
Yeah, good point. I don't think we should go to pharmaceutical agents as our first effort, right? And if we go to a doctor, they're gonna pull that to you. So yeah, speaking of lavender, this is French lavender oil. I have it right here on my desk. I believe in some of that very much so, but I think for me, it just helps clear my head and sort of settle, and it's a mindfulness kind of exercise. So I think some of those can be useful. I think, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good scientific basis for a lot of the potential benefits of some of the additives and vitamins and things like that. I think there's huge potential though for them in certain areas. I think hopefully we'll know more about that. I think we are way too fast to go toward prescription medications that ignore more holistic kinds of things. I think generally just as eating and being as healthy as we can goes a long way. But I do like and maybe it's just pleasure, but I like the smell of lavender. I like other kinds of things, and maybe it's just psychological. But I think for me, there's some benefit in that. It's just calming. But I think it's probably strictly the association I've created for it, as opposed to maybe any kind of internal mechanism going on. But I think if something makes you feel better, and I'm talking about more a scent or oils or those kinds of things, then I don't see a great harm with them. If it's supplements or something you're ingesting in your body, that gets a little trickier. And I would run down that with people that are knowledgeable. We did a thing, you might check it out, Scott, I think it's on our YouTube channel, with Lulu Cook from Australia, the dietitian. We had a dietitian on a couple of different things. I have a podcast with her on my series, and when we did the Super Saturday Recovery Summit things, she was on there. But she's, anyway, marvelous dietitian who has a lot of good information about addictive disorders and how different supplements and eating and different kinds of foods can help certain situations. So I think getting somebody who really knows what they're talking about with addiction would be really useful. But I think a lot of people don't, unfortunately. So you got to be really careful.
Yeah. And there are things that don't involve any of that. The grounding techniques, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just 5 things I see, 4 things I hear, go through your senses, or 4, 7, 8 breathing that are,
Exactly.
which is proven to drop people's blood pressure. I mean, there are tons of things to do before even going to, over the counter stuff.
Visualization, there's all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. So what's the relationship between period of meth use versus brain cell regeneration time? So how long does it take the reward center to reset? If someone tried meth 3 or 4 times over several months, how long does it take to recover versus 3 or 4 years of meth use? How does comorbid sex addiction affect this? Is it harder to recover because sex reminds you of your drug experience and vice versa, et cetera, et cetera? Great question.
Yeah, good stuff here. So methamphetamine, of all the drugs and all the behaviors, causes the most destruction to the dopamine system that we're talking about, because it actually eats away the dopamine receptors. It's neurotoxic, unlike any other drug. And so methamphetamine does cause this kind of functional brain injury that fortunately is reversible, but it can take a while. We know from studies at the National Institute on Drug Abuse that for a chronic meth user, full brain recovery takes 24 months, up to 24 months, which is a long time. Because if you don't have full adequate dopamine distribution, you can't regulate your moods, you have a lot of depression, you have a lot of impulsivity, there's a lot of hopelessness. So it's a lot of bad stuff kind of swimming around while the meth addict is trying to get their brain back on track. And that often, I think, accounts for a lot of the relapse we see with meth. So the good news is those things regenerate. The bad news is it takes a long time. Now, interestingly, sex and porn addicts, as I mentioned earlier, also have that dopamine damage that it heals much faster than a meth user. Meth addicts, as you say, take a long time. Now, the problem with meth and sex, as your question kind of implies, you're actually compounding the problem, right? So you're getting that double whammy of a sex connection and the drug effect, and those reinforce each other, making it very hard to break away from them. So it's very common, for example, somebody who's fused drugs and sex, if I see a sexy person on the street, I may have an urge to use cocaine, right? Or if I smoke cannabis, I may have to go look at porn. Those things get really kind of tied up in a way that do mutually reinforce each other and make it harder to quit. So I think the only answer again is abstinence, and to be really vigilant about managing those cues. They do fade. The cues do slowly extinguish. The brain does recover. The problem is that we often can slow down that recovery by fantasizing. So a lot of people, especially drug users, will think, well, if I for example, meth users chemsex meth users, somebody who's combined meth and sex, they may not be ingesting the meth. They're dry, right? They're not putting meth in their body. But I've had clients say to me, I want meth sex without the meth. Meth causes all these problems, but I want that kind of intensity. So they're still using meth porn. They're still using meth fantasies. They're still wrapped up in meth. And we know from fMRI scans that your brain looks just the same. It doesn't matter if you ingest the meth or not. If you're fantasizing about using meth, and this is crazy for people to get their head around, but it's as bad as if you're using the drug, because it slows down your recovery, if not stops it dead in its tracks, because you're still actively engaged in all the fantasy, all the thinking, all the preoccupation. You're just not following through. So it's a dangerous game to play, and people don't keep their recovery long in that context. But I'll grant you, it's really hard to break the sex and drug connection, because you're getting the triggers and cues from both sides, and it gets hard. But it can be done, but it's hard.
Yeah, and that last bit that David just talked about, fantasizing about it. This is doubly true for porn addiction,
right?
In particular. If I'm fantasizing about pornography that I've seen before, but I'm not using porn right now, and particularly if I reward it with masturbation and an orgasm, I might as well be using porn. I basically am using porn. I'm just using memory of porn instead of actually, clicking and scrolling.
And if I could
So,
just say, the same is true for not porn, right? So
right.
you can look at Instagram or Facebook or whatever, all the thirst trap pictures, and it's the
Mhm.
same as looking at porn in your brain, no
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah, we've talked about not porn. Not porn is not porn, but we use it like as if it's porn. We use it to generate sexual fantasy and to escape. And porn addiction, sex addiction are fantasy addictions. It's the fantasy that gets us out of our head. It's not the actual sex or the orgasm. As a matter of fact, the orgasm brings sex addiction and porn addiction to a screeching
Right,
halt usually.
right, right.
Pop, I'm back in the real world. We pop the bubble. Meth, we kind of have to wait for it to leave our system, which takes a long time, doesn't it, David?
Yeah, it takes a matter of days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the meth users will say they're high for what, like 8 hours off of a hit, or
Well, the meth molecule actually blocks the dopamine receptor for 8 to 10 hours. So,
yeah,
bang for your buck. I've had meth users say, well, for the cost, I can get a nice long high. The problem is it stays in your system and does all that toxicity for
yeah.
days.
Does
It
lots
kind
of
of eats away.
meth rots people's teeth. I mean, this is the hardest thing in the body is your teeth. After we die, our teeth will be here a million years from now. The rest of us will be gone. Meth rots your teeth. Imagine what it does to your brain. Just, you know, ow. How long did it take you, Scott, to face the fact that it was trauma from your childhood contributing to your addictions? David, same question. It seems in addiction, we minimize our own traumas as children to cope and continue it as adults. I'm going to throw this to David first, because why do we minimize our own traumas? Because I know I came into recovery and somebody said, well, what was your, my therapist asked about my childhood. And I said, oh, it was great. It was fine. My parents were really nice.
Yes.
Upon deeper reflection, there were issues, but why do we do that? And
Yeah.
then how long does it take to come around?
I think part of that is just a remnant of child development. Kids really up to adulthood are, the brain is wiring, we're getting our personalities developed, and kids in any kind of adverse circumstances take ownership of whatever happens to them. They believe whatever happens to them. They're literally not able to refute stuff that's coming at them. They're not wired to do that because kids are totally dependent on their caretakers. And so kids will put up with an amazing amount of stuff because they don't know a choice, right? It's survival. And so to make that work, they'll twist themselves in all these beliefs about themselves, about who they are and what they're worth and all that, just to get through, to survive this period in their lives. The problem is then we grow up, those circumstances change, and suddenly we have these core beliefs about ourselves that are quite destructive. And sometimes they're obvious, if there's been abuse, that's clear to a child. Other times it's more subtle, like the example Scott just mentioned, where we know that if there's what's called a lack of parental attunement, and parental attunement means if I, as a parent, I take an interest in my kids, I say, I love you, how was the game today? Gee, that drawing is pretty, whatever, but I'm involved in their lives. So many addicts were provided for materially, but their parents never really got involved in an emotional way. And we know now from research that we call that neglect, and that actually can result in trauma. And a lot of the addicts have just that kind. I can't tell you how many clients I've had say, I had a great childhood. And then we start looking at it, it's like, well, maybe not so much. But I think, so there's that kind of trauma that people might not be aware of. There's trauma that, I had with some death of a sibling and other stuff that was, it's obvious there was issues there. And so for me, it was just trying to numb that and obliterate it and just not feel it. And that finally just crashed and I couldn't do that anymore. So I was aware of my trauma. What I wasn't aware of until I got in recovery and therapy in recovery was the extent that early childhood stuff had influenced everything I thought about, how I perceived myself, my thoughts, how I viewed the world. It had kind of tainted my whole being. And so recovery for me was a way of almost learning a new way of living, free of that. That was my case. Scott,
Yeah, when I got into recovery, like I said, I was initially just clueless, and then I kind of overcompensated, and I did it very quickly because I was very happy to blame someone other than myself for my addiction. And I think Pat Carnes says sanity is a commitment to reality at all costs. And I finally had to realize, okay, nobody held a gun to my head and made me engage in addiction. I mean, it wasn't that trauma never happened. Nobody's ever poured alcohol down my throat, or said, go chase sex in the bushes. Nobody told me to do that. I made decisions that were unhealthy for me. And I had to learn that my trauma mostly just created unhealthy coping mechanisms. And, I've got a happy medium. My parents did the best they could. They both lost a parent very early. They were both parentified. They both had to grow up way too fast. And, neither of them got enough love or attention. Of course, they were not perfect parents. They did the best they could. But initially, once I found out, oh, my childhood wasn't perfect, I wanted to point the fingers and so, but and it took me longer to kind of come back to reality then.
And I think one of the great kind of healing things in that is and this took me a long time, by the way, not fast in recovery, I mean years in recovery, was to realize that my parents also were wounded people, right? They also had issues, and it kind of my heart melted when I realized that, right? That we're all people that are trying to do the best we can, and it helps soften that whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation 5 or 6 years ago with my mother that was very healing for both of us. It was about anxiety, and she said, I never feel safe. I've never felt safe in my life. And I was like, yep, I get it. And I mean, there was so much empathy for that, because of course I've felt that same, and vice versa. It was a healing moment for both of us, to just admit that, we just want to feel safe, and we don't, I mean, I've got a lot more recovery and a lot more therapy, but, yeah. Love this next question too. Is there exposure therapy that is used to treat OCD that is useful for treating porn use as well? Like, you watch porn, but you don't objectify it. Instead, you humanize the person, or think about sex trafficking issues, and so on. And then it says new flawed strategy ? And I'm just going to give you a big yes, definitely a flawed strategy. David, all yours.
Yeah, so exposure therapy is a kind of very specific therapy that's used for certain kind of phobias that we gradually introduce something to somebody, and so they can get used to seeing it, and it helps to allay the anxiety about a specific phenomenon or act or behavior. I agree with Scott, that just doesn't work with porn, because you're opening up, opening up something that your brain finds just delectable with dopamine, and you can't, the whole context is tainted, right? To try to do the kind of remedial therapeutic work you're talking about within the context of porn, it just doesn't work. Our brains don't work that way. The way porn and any kind of addictive trigger can pull us in, I would say it's impossible to work with that in a therapeutic way. It's interesting. It's not quite the same, but there's been a little bit of effort to deal with apps, the apps on the phone, the hookup apps, in a couple treatment settings, not ours, but where they have groups, and they go on Grindr, Scruff, or Tinder as a group and say, well, let's look at this. Did you get triggered by this image? You're triggered by that image. And I think basically what they found was that instead of any kind of healing process, people just got triggered, basically, because once you're in that environment, it's really hard to do all the kind of therapeutic work you're doing. So I think there's other ways. Now, the things you described, do we need to do? Yes. Do we need to rehumanize and build empathy and see people as not objectified, or as not as a body part, or all that stuff? Yeah, we need to do that. But trying to do it in the context of porn, I think, is a flawed strategy.
Yeah. And exposure therapy, I always consider most trauma work to be various forms of exposure therapy, where we're talking about our past trauma in a safe setting, and we're processing our past trauma in a safe setting, and it loses power. But this is kind of the opposite of that. It's just like reinforcing the problem, and trying to tell your brain to not do what your brain automatically does. I don't see that working. And since we're on these alternative therapies, aversion therapy has been tried for porn addiction, and it's been tried with sex offenders, and it's been tried with other forms of addiction. It doesn't work.
LGBT people.
Yeah, LGBT people, change your sexual orientation.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. It can work for very short periods of time. In studies with smoking, I think aversion therapy works for very short periods of time, but then it fails. Am I on target with that?
That's exactly right. And there's never been a study that proved anything different. So basically by punishing ourselves or someone else in that form of therapy, with negative stimuli, ranging from, by the way, electric shocks to making people throw up to, really cruel kinds of stuff when they're exposed to certain stimuli, that out of just sheer, I think, panic and fear, it has some effectiveness to make the pain stop. But as soon as the adverse circumstances are gone, the effect stops as well. So, just like even good dog training, right? We do it with positive reinforcement. I think that's the way. The aversion therapy kind of stuff is, every single therapeutic board considers that, unethical. A lot of places in the United States, it's illegal. So I think we've got to really be careful about some of those formalized aversion therapy plans. But I think, I think there's some general, I don't know if you'd consider like a rubber band, Scott, aversion therapy, those kind of things were just reminders. Those I think are a little more benign, but even those I think.
I consider rubber band more of a thought stopping than an aversion therapy. It's just like I'm conscious that I'm having a thought I don't want. I snap the rubber band. Yeah, it hurts, but it's not the pain that gets me out of my head. It's the simple act of pulling the rubber band, doing something else to break the thought. So
yes, yeah, it's a misinformed therapy from my point of view, and just really cruel.
Yeah, and it's been proven time and time again to not work. There's a really great question that just came in, but I'm going to save it for next week because we're out of time, and this question needs several minutes to answer. So I'm going to save it for next week. I promise that will be the first question we address next week. Thank you, David, for your time and thoughtful presentation and questions. And thank you, everybody, for showing up and asking great questions. We'll be back same time, same place next week. David, anything to take us out?
Everybody has anxiety. We got to figure out how to deal with it in a productive way. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, thank you. Good night.
Thanks,
and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.